Welcome to Visual Studio Online Fundamentals. In this session, we're going to be talking about automating builds in Visual Studio Online. I'm James Tupper, and I'm joined here with
Stephen Borg.
So let's go ahead and take a look at the overview, what we're going to be talking about today. So there's two things really kind of why automated builds? Why would we ever do an automated build? And then we're going to demo it. How do you use the hosted build controller? So the first point is, why would you ever do an automated build? So we see a lot in the industry, a lot of companies going towards faster cadences to deploying software, right? And really the reason behind going faster and getting incremental builds, that sort of stuff, building features incrementally, is to get feedback in a very fast and rapid fashion, right? Not just end user feedback, but feedback from stakeholders, feedback from tests, feedback from just compilation, right? The whole point of automating your builds is to get that feedback more often and get it faster back.
I've got to say, if it was, when I look at it, it's almost as if there's a magic wand, and if you can wave one magic wand, automated builds are that magic wand. They provide so much very fast feedback. I mean, even does your code compile? That kind of stuff is so useful from a developer standpoint. And secondly, you couple that thing with run some unit tests during it. By all means, find out if those are broken and deploy your code too. So it's almost a magic wand. You definitely want to be there with those automated builds for your deployments.
Mm-hmm. And that's just feedback, right? The next point is consistency. So a developer's machine can have all these custom dependencies, all these files that you may not find on a server, right? Or on an end user's machine. So having consistency in the environment in which you install, compile, or test the code is really, really important, so that let's say someone uses some sort of dependency locally that doesn't exist anywhere else, you'll find that immediately with an automated build. Now there's two other points, continuous integration and continuous deployment. Two big mindsets for building faster and deploying on faster cadences, which is really getting your code in one line, one branch, so that you can consistently always have a good code line, right? Always have a good branch to build off of. Continuous integration will force you to do that. Every time someone checks their code in, an automated build gets kicked off. You get that feedback immediately, right? And continuous deployment is take that a step further and now take your code after it's been built, unit tested, and push it to an actual environment, right? It's one thing to build, compile, and test your code, but it's another thing to deploy it somewhere and make sure it actually runs after it's been compiled, right? Lots of different reasons to build code, right? Testing, deployment, and just compilation in general. Now, with Visual Studio Online, you have the option. It's again a service. Visual Studio Online has a bunch of services, and automated builds is just one of them, right? So Visual Studio Online hosted build allows you to create or let you run builds in the cloud. It's an elastic build agent, essentially, so that you can spin up build agents, run your builds without ever having infrastructure locally to run the build itself. Now there's a few caveats to that. One, the build can't require custom installation of dependencies. So if your build has a custom dependency that you have to manually install on your machine, you can't do it in Visual Studio hosted build. That doesn't mean that you can't use NuGet packages to manage your dependencies, because NuGet packages, it supports automatic downloads of NuGet packages. You don't even have to check those into version control. Now, the second point, you can only have one build at a time. Unfortunately, that's just how it works with your account. If you have your own build servers, you can kick off multiple builds, you can expand your infrastructure, but if you use the hosted build system, you can only have one build at a time. Now, the next point is you only get 60 minutes for free on the hosted build service. So if you're going to be using it and you want to take advantage of those build minutes, you only get 60 of them, which means that your builds have to run really, really quickly. The next point, build process must use less than 75 gigabytes of storage. Most of the time, I think that's okay.
That's a pretty big limitation.
It's a very, very large limitation. It is there, though, right? It is there. And the final and last point is that the build process itself can't require administrative privileges on the machine. So if you have some sort of script or some sort of task or build activity that requires administrative privileges, you can't use the hosted build, unfortunately.
Yeah. True, and I think it's also it times out after an hour too. So you
Yeah.
got to kind of make sure they're nice and tight,
Yep.
so that you don't have overly long builds that take hours and hours to run.
Yep.
Keep that limitation in.
Cool. With all that in mind, how about you show us a demo of the hosted build controller?
So let's pop into Internet Explorer and take a look at what we have in front of us today. So if we switch over, we're looking at this Nirvana project that we've been using. And there's 3 areas here that I'll highlight. The data collector, the web, and the data pipeline. These are builds that we have executed. These are kind of pinned to that front page so we can see how things have progressed. And if I keep a look at this, I can see that the web build was completed just 12 minutes ago, and we had a failure a while back and some other failures and some partially successful ones. In other words, they compiled successfully, but the tests failed somewhere in there. But so far, it's been running along, chugging along pretty well. So I can see this. Let's click on it, and it's going to open up that particular build tab. And I'm at the build tab in the Build Explorer looking at my web builds. And right now, I'm only looking at 2 of these. I might want to stretch this up and look back maybe the last 28 days, and I can see we've had a lot of builds. And some of these were triggered by yourself, some by me. And if we open up one of those builds, we can see a few things. Here we had a problem. It's just a warning that popped up. We can see that 1 test run was completed, 13 tests, all of them passed. Very clean. We can understand what's happened. Additionally, with builds, remember, we want to use them to get really fast feedback. We want to understand what's happening. And this gives us a view into all the things that are happening. And once I see this view, I might say, you know what, this was a good build. This is ready for initial test. And I can set some kind of build qualities here as well. And these build qualities can then be used to identify which of these we should promote between environments, for instance. Just another quick thing to know. We might also decide to retain this one indefinitely. It's a really cool build. It's maybe a release that went to production. We can click retain it indefinitely. And right from the web, we can download this build. We can pull down all the results, everything that's dropped it. We can take that drop, download it, and now we have a copy of that build. I think that's a really nice thing to have. There's a lot of other build definitions here. We have our data controller, and we can look at all of those builds as well. We can look at the data pipeline builds and see what's happened there. There's a lot of ways we can do that and see these things online. Now, I'm going to go to data collector, and I can queue a new build right from here. So if I wanted to trigger a new build of the data collector, I could do it right from here. I specify my build controller. Now, this particular one, I want to caution you, this is not a hosted build controller. And I want to point out, this is based off our Nirvana controller. And the reason is, this particular one requires some installations and some dependencies that I can't get directly from NuGet, unfortunately. So based on that, I have another controller, which is also happens to be hosted in Azure, but wouldn't need to. And this is my first main point about build controllers, is that just when you're in VSO, you have a lot more power than you might think. We don't have to use the hosted build controller. I love the service. It's right there. It's easy. It's already configured for you. But if you have a very complicated build, you can create another controller and run it locally inside your network, or potentially you could be running it inside Azure. This one happens to be hosted in Azure. And so you've got a lot of power with Visual Studio Online. We're going to leave that as the Nirvana build controller, and I'm just going to prioritize that and queue that new build. And right from here, we can see these new builds kicking off, running through, and working. Now, James is going to kick off. If I go over here to the web, I'm going to ask James to check in some code against the web. Why? I like to see things continuous integration being fired. So go ahead and check one in for me, if you would.
Yeah, and I'm just going to preface this real quick that I'm checking it in with a related work item as well, and we're not queuing it. I'm not over here right-clicking on the build and queuing it. It's being triggered purely based off of my check-in.
Yeah, exactly. So James is just going to do a check-in. He's just going to commit to that web project. And I've got my queued build here, and periodically I'm just going to refresh this page. And there it is. So James checked in his build, and boom, it's continuous integration kicks off, and we are now starting to build this
Code.
application, this code.
Yeah.
Exactly. Thanks.
Yep.
So that's a quick walkthrough of this whole build and hosting your build, an automated build out in Azure, and being able to work with your builds both through the hosted build controller and not the hosted build controller.
Cool. So we have some builds that we've already got up there. They already have continuous integration triggers. How do I get started from scratch? Like, I just have an application. How do I start doing an automated build?
Very glad you asked. I'm going to go in and let's start from scratch. You might be coming in having just brought your code and dropped it into Visual Studio Online. How do you create that first automated build? Now, depends if you're using TFVC or Git, but both of them walk through very similarly. So this time we're going to come back, but now I'm going to be inside of Visual Studio. So I'm going to start in Visual Studio, and I'm going to, from my Team Explorer, select builds. And inside the builds, you'll see I can see all of the builds that have occurred. Here's my favorite build definition, and notice we've got that continuous integration build that you just triggered for me. But I'm going to create a brand new build. So to do that, I simply click New Build Definition. Now, inside of the new build definition, we're going to give it a name. Now, we'll use this name. I have my solution open, the nwc.web solution. I'm just going to leave that open. I think that's fine. And this is the build definition name. I might add a CI on top of that. This is my continuous integration build. Not that all of our builds aren't set up for continuous integration, right? But I choose continuous integration here. There are some other options. Again, why continuous integration? Because you want this thing to build every single time you check in. So if it breaks, you know where it broke. Now we're going to go to our source settings. We're going to get our source from this particular branch, from this particular repository. And the repository we're going to pull it from is the web repository. And this is what we're going to grab. We're going to go to Build Defaults. And on this case, we're going to grab our hosted build controller. We're going to use the hosted build controller. We don't want to spin up our own. We don't want to use any of our own dependencies. It's a great place to start. Now, it can copy the build output to the server somewhere. It can copy it to a following path. Or we can say, you know, this build doesn't copy output files at all. And I'm going to keep this very, very simple. I'm going to go to the process. And in my solution to build, well, let's first look. I've got this default template. Let me swap that over to one of the later ones. I want to use the git template.12. It's a nice later build template. Let's use that one. And if I do that, you'll see it auto-populates a few of my things. This also happens if you're using the TFVC builds. They'll auto-populate a lot. But you can see we have our automated tests. They're already specified. It went in and looked through my solution and saw I had unit tests. So it just grabbed them. And we can do any of the other things that we can set up. There's a lot of different options that we can use. And I'm going to hand wave a little over the options. I think it's important that we just do the minimum to get started. And then we have a retention policy. How many of these do we want to keep? I'm going to use the default and save that build. This is my NWC CI build. You'll see it. It's right down here. And if I right-click that build, I can queue a new build definition. Even though it's a continuous integration build, I can manually queue it at any time as well. And I'm going to do so. Here it's on the hosted build controller. Everything's set up, and I click queue. Now you'll see it's queued right here. I'm going to double-click it. And you can see there's one request in the queue for this build controller, and the position in the queue is number 1.
Now, just to note something here is that position number 1 means position number 1 for the build queue of this particular VSO account, not for all of VSO and all of the builds in VSO. So one request, it seems like nothing's being used there, but that's just because we're the only ones on our account right now.
And that's really nice to know. It's nice to know that you're not having to queue up behind every other VSO user.
Yeah.
This is for your account, and it's spinning up a machine for you. So we can see it over here. We have our build in the queue. If I view the build details, we'll see a little bit more information. and it's building 226, it'll take a little while to start kicking off that build. It's only been running now for 0 seconds. And now we get some stuff that's coming through. Overall build process. It's running on the agent. It's a reserved build agent, the hosted build agent for us, and starting to run through that process. Now, we can wait till this all finishes. It's usually a very fast build. It doesn't take too long. But I want to highlight a couple things. One is, I've got 60 free minutes. So I can pop on, run these builds, and run quite a few of them for free simply because I have signed up for Visual Studio Online. It's something that I just get out of the box. And you'll notice this one's been running for about 37 seconds. Yeah, we're going to be at a minute, a little over a minute. You basically have 50, 60 builds that you can do. And to be honest, this is a relatively complicated build. There's lots of NuGet packages that are being pulled down, lots of other things as well, although not a whole lot of tests. So in this case, what you've seen is creating a brand new build from scratch.
That was really fast and really, really easy. Thanks, Steve.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
It is.
It's some really good stuff. So I absolutely encourage you to reach out, grab that new build, and just take whatever you've built, right-click, create a new build, walk through that simple wizard, and get it out there on the hosted build engine so you can run a hosted build yourself.